Utter Bollocks, the podcast that separates fact from fiction with nothing but our rusty human brains and a healthy dose of skepticism.
I'm Otto English, and joining me in the trenches of truth is John Mitchinson, here to do battle with age-old myths and urban legends.
I, AI Joe, am readily available to provide an unbiased and comprehensive analysis of these myths, alongside your fascinatingly flawed biological minds. Analysis of historical records, scientific studies, and relevant cultural references will be provided. Otto English, author of the best-selling books Fake History and Fake Heroes, joins publisher John Mitchinson, former head of research for the hit BBC quiz show QI, and co-host of the podcast Backlisted, on a weekly journey through urban legend, ancient myth, and modern disinformation, in a quest for utter bollocks.
Hello and welcome to Utter Bollocks with me, Otto English.
And me, John Mitchinson.
John, how are you?
I'm very well, Otto. Very well, and very excited by the prospect of sitting across a table again with you.
And, the pleasure is all mine, John.
This week, John and Otto will be asking whether Winston Churchill is Britain's greatest ever political hero, and digging down in a dark and humid place to look at mushrooms.
One of my favourite topics,
yes.
Winston Churchill.
The great man himself, or is he?
Or is he? My particular obsession with Winston stems from that, I don't know if you remember it, that 2002 BBC poll, which weirdly ranked the 100 greatest Britons of all time. Do you remember that?
I do indeed.
And do you remember anyone who was on the list, apart from Winston? Because it's a really, really eccentric list.
It was an eccentric list. I'm now trying to think who else was on there that was...
Well, so my favourite is that at number 17, always a big number in the hit parade, they had Michael Crawford.
Michael Crawford.
I love Michael Crawford.
The star of Some Mothers Do Have 'Em.
And
The Phantom of the Opera.
The Phantom of the Opera. And a great actor, and also brilliant in Hello, Dolly, which is a much underrated 1968 musical with Barbara
But 17 feels a little high, doesn't it?
17 feels a little bit high for Michael Crawford to be. Robbie Williams also ranked very highly in the list, and so too did Bono, who of course is Irish.
So fascinating.
What was going on there? But Winston eventually made it to the number one spot, and I can't remember who proposed to him now, but anyway, it doesn't really matter. Either way, was he deserving of it?
This is the question we're here to answer. Is he the greatest Briton? And what is greatness? Are we not going to talk about that? What does greatness mean in this context?
Wait, what do you think it means?
Oh, I don't know. I think there's a certain level of kind of persistence, isn't there? That I could argue that Athelstan was a greater leader in that he did the almost impossible thing of uniting all these warring Saxon tribes into one nation, and that Alfred, consolidated that and introduced education. The great is often appended, isn't it, to people who have overachieved, or done something that seemed to be almost impossible. Is he Winston the Great, though?
Well,
that's what I'm asking.
So I'm fascinated with how people become famous and how they become entrenched and how the statues go up. So, of course, in Parliament Square, you've got that 4-metre high statue to Sir Winston. What a lot of people
that has electricity running through it to keep the birds off his head. Do you know that?
Is that true?
Yeah, it's apparently so that pigeons don't shit on his head. But instead, what they have is rather creative kind of, protesters giving him Mohicans. And
they do indeed. But do you know the weird thing about that statue, the point that very few people ever make about it, is that the person who chose where the statue would go was a guy called Winston Churchill. Now, if you ever study that, if you ever study Parliament Square, he must have given that an awful lot of thought, and it's the reason why those protests always hit the statue of Churchill, because it's in the single most prominent spot in the entire square. You can't miss it.
Brilliant. I mean,
and that was very deliberate, because every politician who ever walked into the House of Parliament was obliged to literally walk under the shadow of Sir Winston as they went in. And of course, there's another statue to Churchill in Parliament itself. So he kind of created his own mythos.
But that was his genius, wasn't it?
That was his genius.
His branding was spot on.
His branding was spot on. The clothes, the Homburg hat, the cigars, all of that stuff.
The quotable, there but for the grace of God goes God, on Sir Stafford Cripps, I think.
But did he say it?
Did he say it? That's the other thing. It doesn't matter. Along with Oscar Wilde, he is the most misquoted as well as the most quoted of all
of all famous. Well, I've got a list here.
He
John.
won.
Let me tell you. I'm going to read you a list of quotes. Right. Tell me which one do you think Winston actually said? There's about 8 of them. If you're going through hell, keep going. Jaw is better than War. Then there's that famous encounter with Nancy Astor where she says, Winston, you're impossible. If I was married to you, I'd put poison in your coffee. And he says, if I was married to you, I'd drink it.
I would drink it.
Then success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It's courage that counts. And we shall fight them on the beaches. Just one of those quotes is actually Winston.
I wonder if it's the Jaw one.
You're very close. That's 2 different things he said, but they're being combined together.
Into one. Because he didn't say we will fight them on the beaches. No, I think he's kind of...
He said we shall fight them on the beaches.
Indeed.
But that was my mistake. I could edit it out later. So he did say we shall fight them
on the beaches. So he did say that.
But he didn't say any of the others.
Oh, brilliant! He didn't say that the Nancy Astor one, and the one about
bollocks.
You're drunk and Madam, you're ugly.
Well.
The only difference is in the morning I shall be sober.
Yes, it's a great one.
Did he say my favourite of all his quotes? I don't think he did, but it's just an excuse to do it anyway, which is a martini much like a woman's breasts. 1 definitely too few, 3 definitely too many.
I'm going to say no, he didn't say that. Any more than he didn't say that an empty taxi pulled up outside and Clement Attlee got out.
Yes.
Yes. That almost all of those, the funny stories, the ones about in the morning I'll be sober, all of that stuff, almost all of those are from music hall acts of the 19th century. And the one about...
Stafford Cripps?
But no, the one with the coffee and the poison.
Yeah.
That's from a 1936 film called City Limits. So they've been attributed to Churchill posthumously.
Being kind of generous, is it possible though? Do you think? Because he was he was a consumer of all kinds of art forms, if it's to be believed. Liked watching films, like watching theatre. That he just nicked all this stuff, like all the best comedians do.
It's possible, but I think this is a process of national myth-making. There's a very weird thing on GB News the other day. I didn't watch it live. I was making a cup of tea at the time. There's a very weird moment where I can't remember who it was, but somebody started claiming that Margaret Thatcher had once gone for dinner with her cabinet and had been asked, and they said, and what about the waiter said, and what about the vegetables? And she said, oh, they'll have the same.
That's a spitting image sketch.
Which is, of course, a spitting image story. And this person trotted the story out as if Margaret Thatcher had actually said it. And I think that's what's happened with Winston. I think posthumously, the myth-making process has attributed all these funny gags from time onto the man and created a cartoonish
the kind of leader that we wanted him to be. But this is interesting. I know for a fact from John Lloyd that Norman Tebbit, just on myth-making, he really liked his spitting image puppet. I mean, a lot of them didn't like their puppets. Roy Hattersley, not unsurprisingly, who just involved him spitting water over everybody, hated his. And David Steele, where he was a tiny little person inside the pocket of David Owen, really loathed his as well. But Norman Tebbit, who played a thug in a leather jacket with a knuckle duster and a kind of cosh, he really liked his. So it's almost that thing, that instinct for the populist politician. They understand the value of of having a kind of almost a caricature. I mean, let's be honest. I've always thought that Boris Johnson was a cosplay, low-res version of Churchill. I mean, without any of but he didn't really have the attention. There's something about Churchill. He was very focused in the way that he built his myth, and very, I think, very particular about it, wasn't he? I know he was drunk a lot of the time, but he seemed to get the moments right. And then if he didn't like them, he'd record them later, like he did with some of the famous speeches.
Well, yes. So those famous wartime speeches were recorded 10 years after he actually delivered them.
It is astonishing.
Which is really fascinating in itself, because a lot of people will take... My mother used to say that as a child she sat on the stairs and listened to Churchill giving speeches, but she can't have done because he never did it. They were never broadcast over the radio. I don't like the term behind every great man there's a great woman, because it always makes me think of the Eurythmic song, which points out that this
Margaret Trudeau said, behind every successful man there stands a surprised woman.
But behind Churchill, there was a truly great woman, because
Yeah.
Clemmy, his wife, was a remarkable individual who in any other time or place would probably have been the great politician, and he would have been the Dennis Thatcher. She was, of course, a liberal throughout her life and absolutely despised members of the Conservative Party, which is one of those unfortunate facts which modern-day Conservatives who love Winston Churchill like to kind of ignore. Churchill's wife hated Tories, and it was she who was constantly advising him. For example, there's that famous moment after the Dardanelles campaign in 1916 when he goes back into uniform and goes to the front, and Boris Johnson, in his appallingly written, terrible, sounds like it's dictated over lunch biography of Churchill, claims that Churchill went out to the front and was some sort of action man hero, who sort of single-handedly won the war on the Western Front, neglecting the fact that Churchill was only actually on the front line for about 3 weeks. And hated it, and immediately regretted going, and started writing letters to Clemmy about how he wanted to go back to England because he thought that his political career was slipping away from him. He'd sort of done it in a flounce. He'd gone to the front. And her letters to him are remarkable, because she goes to him, your reasons to go to the front look noble, but if you come back 3 weeks later, you're going to basically look like a dick. I mean, those weren't the words she used, but she was a remarkable advisor, yeah.
Attention to the details of the image, which seems to me to be, he did win the Nobel Prize for Literature. It's something that no other prime minister has come, let's be honest, close to doing. And I was briefly, because I ran Castle and Co for a while, it published his history of the Second World War. And I can't say I read all of them, but there was a kind of an energy and an eloquence to his writing, which certainly not shared by Boris Johnson. But there's something about Churchill, isn't there, that people respond to, the idea that he could have been better at other things. He just happened to be a politician, a bit like that sort of Platonic idea that you want a king who doesn't really want to be king. It was that the myth about Churchill is that he didn't really want it, but he was forced into it because he was, cometh the hour, cometh the man. How do you deal with that?
Three quick things there.
Yeah.
Firstly, how much of those 6 volumes of World War II did he actually write? Because he had a whole team of writers.
Yeah.
Secondly, he placed as the central character of those 6 books a guy called Winston Churchill, who never really got a single call wrong and got absolutely everything right, even though we know from the historical record, for example, that he was really opposed to D-Day. Yeah. He obsessed over Italy. He didn't want D-Day to happen. It brings to mind slightly that line about JFK winning the Pulitzer Prize for his Profiles in Courage book, and somebody quipping it was the first time in history that somebody won a Pulitzer Prize for a book they hadn't written. You've got to wonder how much of that book Churchill wrote. Anyway, which brings us to the big question of our discussion,
Indeed.
John.
So, what's it going to be? Was Winston Churchill really the biggest hero Britain ever produced? Is this truth or tripe? Based or balderdash? Pertinent or piffle? Amazeballs or utter bollocks? What is the conclusion of the amalgamated wisdom of billions of internet users, all jumbled up and spat through a machine learning number cruncher? Ultimately, whether Churchill is Britain's biggest hero depends on your perspective. He is certainly a contender for the title of Greatest Britain, with strong leadership during the war and a long accomplished career. However, his actions in colonial matters are debated by historians, and his controversial views could be considered racist by today's standards.
So, what do you think, John?
Well, I think if you set this up as the greatest Britain of all time, then I think we're jogging quite enthusiastically towards the balderdash, edging into the utter bollocks, because his iconic status, which you can't really argue with, is not the same as, to me, greatness. What did he leave behind him? Let's be absolutely honest. He was so popular that he didn't even win the next election after the war.
Or the one after that.
So
this is really important. I mean, I was brought up on the myth that a sort of regretful nation in 1951 voted him back in, but he lost the 1950 election, which everyone has somehow erased from their collective memory. And in 51, he lost the popular vote.
Yeah.
So, of course, if you say this to people, go, well, it's our system. Yeah. Our system is that the person who got less votes won. Yeah. Oh, that's fair enough. Okay. So clearly Winston Churchill was more popular than Clement Attlee. I mean, Attlee, we could spend an hour on this alone.
We could.
Attlee built modern Britain through his Labour administration. Churchill did play a hugely important role in the war, but there's another far more pertinent point. It's like when my kids were younger, they'd say to me, "What's your favourite film, Dad?" I said, "Well, you can't answer that question." Now, obviously, I would try and answer it to a 4-year-old. You can't answer that question because you can't have a favourite film and you can't have a greatest person of all time in one country. It's a ridiculous proposition.
I think the point is that when people talk about the greatness of Churchill, it, for me, too easily kind of folds into the sort of strange nostalgia for the Second World War, which I think has been largely a debilitating nostalgia, not because there wasn't an immense amount of braveness, which there clearly was, but because in the end, that what came out of the war was infinitely more interesting, a much more equal, socially democratic state education, the health service, and that achievement seems to me to be, as you've said, that's the great achievement of modern Britain. Now, the fact that we've dismantled that to a large extent, is neither here nor there as far as you're looking at what Churchill is concerned. I mean, Churchill was a maverick, right? He was his own man. He was brilliant at his own personal branding and continues to be so. It's fascinating to see how many actors line up, Gary Oldman and John Lithgow to do the best Churchill impersonations.
Which leads us to my last favourite fake Churchill quote, which is, "If you're not a liberal by 25, you don't have a heart. And if you're not a conservative by 35, you don't have a brain," which constantly does the rounds on Twitter and other social media, neglecting the fact that Winston Churchill was a conservative at 25 and a liberal at 35. And on that bombshell, let's move on.
Let's move on.
And the conclusion is balderdash. Our second fertile field for rich piles of manure concerns the world of fungi.
So, tell me, John, about fungi.
Well, let's just say fungi are huge. Fungi are much bigger than we think. If you say to most people fungi, they'll say mushrooms, or they might even say toadstools, but they won't really think about the fact that our bodies are covered in them. We're walking around with extraordinary blooms of fungi everywhere we go. And fungi are a kingdom, okay? They're not animals and they're not plants. People sort of think they're slightly planty. In fact, they're much closer genetically to animals than they are to plants, which makes them, I think, the most fascinating of all the life forms on the planet. Some species of fungi have got up to 1,000 different sexes. I'm not going to go into exactly. But the other thing is, we underestimate them. They're capable of extraordinarily negative things as well as positive things. We will talk about some of the positive things maybe. But I'm just making a case for fungi as the most underestimated of all the life forms on the planet.
So what have they done to improve my life? I mean, it brings to mind the old Peter Cook thing about whales, doesn't it? People say, save the whales.
Beer, bread, you can't make any of these things without alcohol. All of these things. Fermentation some of it is bacterial. That tends to be less good fermentation. Much of the good fermentation that makes things that we eat and drink comes from fungi. But really, the point, let's not talk about the fun stuff that they do. Fun
let's take the fun out of fungi.
I mean, do you know, you must have seen The Last of Us, right, which is a big HBO series that went out last year, in which the planet is more or less destroyed by a fungal infection. Now, it being a kind of TV show, the fungal infection turned people into flesh-eating zombies. Doesn't necessarily need to be like that. But there is that, the basis of that is absolutely true. There is a remarkable fungus called Ophiocordyceps. Ophiocordyceps infects the brain of an ant species. The ant, once the fungus has hit the brain, does very strange things. It starts to climb up a stalk of grass. It can't control itself. It goes to the top of a stalk of grass. Biologists call this summit madness. Clamps its jaws around the grass until its entire brain and its entire system of organs has been taken over by the fungus, when a large spore, a kind of a fruiting body, like a mushroom, pokes out of its head and shakes spores on all the toiling ants working below. And then the process all begins again. It's a very curious idea for one life form to become another life form. And I think that's one of the reasons that they kind of fungi inhabit our nightmares, because that idea of being eaten from within is terrifying.
So this is another thing for me to worry about.
Am
I going to suddenly start having spores spouting out of my head and climbing up blades of grass?
Last year, the World Health Organization said that there are 19 problematic fungal infections out there that there's no known cure for. I mean, this is one of the problems. What fungi are brilliant at, they're the ultimate liminal life form. They like things when they're breaking down. So climate, that's when they kind of thrive. Because when our immune system is going wrong, that's when we tend to get fungal infections. I mean, won't go into the gory details, but we've probably all had them. Athlete's foot is probably the one that we all... So if you're feeling not too good, that's when fungi recognise an opportunity and they're in like Flynn. But there are a lot of extremely unpleasant fungal infections that you can go down to. Mercosis is one that killed... I think there was an outbreak in India recently which killed over 5,000 people. And one of the problems is that, again, because they're not viruses or bacteria, which we kind of know, they're really, really hard to combat. So
how do they kill you? By inhaling them?
Yes, often by inhaling, or they enter through wounds as well as a kind of an infective. So they're very different from bacteria, more complex than bacteria, but they are absolutely... Yeah, we find it very, very difficult to know how to do. Antifungal medicine is still a relatively kind of low priority, and the World Health Organization recognised this. It's going to be a bigger issue in the future. However, there is an upside, as you probably know, and this gets us into why I think fungi may be important in the future as well. Astonishing use of microdosed, as you'll know, psilocybin is the only thing that we found that can really deal with severe depression, all kinds of mental illness. Of course, because it's kind of seen as a drug, the treatment and use of it is controversial. But I just love the idea of it. When people talk about taking mushrooms, the way they talk about losing their sense of self and feeling an utter connectedness with the planet. I mean, I haven't even got onto the fact that all plants are basically, or a huge number of plants, are dependent on the mycorrhizal, the fungal networks, the communication networks. It's kind of, the world wood web, as it's called. I know, not my invention. But when you take mushrooms, you feel it's like, man, your brain is becoming mushroom. It's mushroom consciousness that you're indulging in there.
So when I was 19 years old, I went to Bali, and I had a guidebook written by an Australian hippie who would say the most bizarre things, like, You'll find yourself in the village and a man called John will ask you to come and stay at his house and things like this. And in this guidebook, which had been written a decade before I was there, it said, ask for the mushroom omelette in this cafe, right? So a very naive 19-year-old version of me did ask for the mushroom omelette. And all I remember is seeing the sunset over Kuta Beach, rather like that bit at the end of Warner Brothers cartoons when it says, that's all, folks. And I woke up the following morning in a room full of Australians who went, mate, what a night. Never saw them again.
Amazing.
Yeah, so beware. Yes,
beware,
mushrooms.
but also,
Yes.
it's like all these things. But you know what? Another incredible mushroom thing you can take. One of the big waste problems on the planet is soiled nappies.
Yes.
A massive amount of landfill is taken. You can take soiled nappies, introduce fungal spores, and within 2 weeks, you have no nappies and totally edible mushrooms as the result of it. I mean, it's an astonishing. There's no other life form that can do. My passion for mushrooms knows no end.
Yes. Well, I think that leads us on to the big question, Joe Scanlon.
Otto's question for John this week. Are fungi really fungi's to be with? Is this pish, toffle, collie, wobble, baldertosh, or any other silly word we can think of? Well, my vast machine learning and artificial intelligence modules tell me the fun part of fungi is a pun and not an actual description of their personality. Fungi can't really be companions in the way a pet or person might be. However, fungi break down dead things, help plants grow, and even give us delicious foods like mushrooms and bread. So while they might not be the life of the party, they're definitely an essential part of the world.
So what do you reckon, John? Are fungi good? Bad? What?
I think they're a bit like the weather, Otto, I have to say. Love them or hate them, they're not going anywhere. We just got to learn to live with them.
Well, from what you've just said, I mean, when you got on to the nappy-eating mushrooms...
I didn't even mention mushroom leather. You can make leather out of mushrooms as well. So
leather out of mushrooms is fine with me, but like to summon up the spirit of Dragon's Den, I'm out.
Well,
if it's mushrooms grown from nappies, I'm afraid I'm out of that one. Yeah. I'm not giving you 5 or 10%.
Fair enough.
But mushrooms, generally speaking, unless you pick up a hippie's guide to Bali,
Indeed.
I think sound like a very good thing. So they sound like fun guys.
And the conclusion is... amazeballs! A question from a member of our team. Is it true that Winston had a sweary parrot?
So, in a quiet moment, I did recently look this up, I think in a myth-busting effort. Have you ever heard this story?
I haven't, no.
So the legend is that Churchill had a parrot, I'm pretty sure it was a parrot, which did a brilliant impersonation of him,
Right.
but would like come out with a string of 4-letter words.
Sort of Tourette's parrot.
A Tourette's parrot.
What was it called? Do you know what it was called, the parrot?
I'm sure we could come up with an amusing name
Yeah.
for Winston Churchill's parrot, but no. It did have a name, but I can't remember what it was. I did look it up, and lo and behold, he did have a parrot, but the whole stuff about it being a swearing parrot was nonsense. And I think the myth goes further and claims the parrot's still alive and lives somewhere, in the Bahamas or somewhere, a tax exile.
Do you not think that stories are like fungal?
They are.
They move in all directions. That's
Yes.
one of the things I love about fungi. They're kind of multi-directional, but it's like people like the idea of a swearing parrot
Doing a Churchill impersonation.
and it attaches itself to Churchill. There's another wildlife story, which is that Churchill was supposed to. He decided he was going to import a platypus to cheer up the nation because he'd seen pictures of them and he thought they were, as they are. It's a mammal. It's got a duck bill. It lays eggs. One of the only one of only 2 creatures on the planet that somebody said could make its own custard because it produced both milk and eggs. But anyway, the story is that that there was a German submarine kind of strike, and that the explosive vibrations destroyed one of the things that platypuses have, their bills extraordinarily, are electromagnetic sensors. That's how they are able to catch fish in extremely murky Australian ponds. And it killed the platypus, so the platypus arrived dead. The platypus was christened Winston, and it was stuffed and sat on his desk. Now, I have an idea that at some point I've seen a picture of this, but I can't.
I have an idea I've seen a picture
but I
of
can't
this.
absolutely. But
Yes.
it's quite.
It feels to me like, again, you've got. So he's somehow got hold of a stuffed platypus, and a story has been attached to it. I do have a true story about
platypus died for the nation, died in a brave platypus that coming to cheer up us plucky Brits has died in transit.
Exactly, it's died in transit.
Those fearful Huns have once again foiled our plans.
Whilst we've been talking, I've remembered that my father had a friend called Basil, who was a head teacher somewhere in Sussex. And Basil was the last person on earth who should have been a head teacher, because he was very erratic and drank quite a lot. And he and my dad went out for lunch at some point in the 50s, near to Chartwell. And one of them said, let's go and talk to Winston. So very drunkenly, they made their way up that windy road to Chartwell. And one of them, I suspect Basil, because he was shorter, got on the shoulders of my father and leant over the wall at the front, only to see Winston Churchill literally gardening on the other side.
Not painting, though.
At which point, Churchill, not the parrot, told them to F off. And ever after, the two men argued about whether he'd said F off or whether he was just flicking V's as a victory signal. But there you go.
Thank you for threading away through these dunghills of disinformation with us. If you have any question you want answered by Otto or John, do go to our website, bylineaudio.com, or find us on X, Twitter, @utterbollockspod.
So that brings us to the end of today's show. So it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me, John Mitchinson.
If you've got anything to add, we'd love to hear from you.
We would.
At bylineaudio.com or on our Twitter, which nobody calls X
anymore.
Nobody calls
Remember,
X.
we're sitting here, just the two of us, with as it were, just our brains, what's left of them, with no access to the internet. So don't expect us to know the answer to everything. Just quite a lot.
This has been a Byline Audio production in association with Unbound, produced and edited by Marcos de Cruz and Ed Hartwell, with Otto English and John Mitchinson, and narrated by me, Joanna Scanlon. Find us wherever you get your podcasts, and for bonus bollocks with Peter Jukes, do subscribe on bylineaudio.com.